Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. This one's going to be once more on Universal Battle to show a couple features that I wasn't able to cover in last time's video. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go get past all of this. We're going to sign in, connect to lobby, and today you'll notice there's actually a lot more people. I think last time it was just me here, so you'll see that it's a little bit more active at this time of day. Let's go ahead and host a game, and I'm going to show you guys. We're going to focus on the pre-made basic armies because I heard a few people wanting to know what those look like, and then we will also focus on terrain. So let's begin with the armies. So what I'm basically going to do is just go through and kind of show you the models they have available for each of the factions and what factions are actually available, because I know some of you were sort of looking at this and wondering what kind of options were available. So there's only one human faction, and it's kind of a mix of units you would expect to see in Bretonia and the Empire. So you've got a Pegasus Knight here, followed by a King, which is just a generic Lord model. A Lady, obviously, could be used as a wizard for the Empire or as a damsel for the Bretonians. Swordsman, Halberdiers. This model is supposed to be a priest, but that could be anything from like a battle pilgrim to a warrior priest to a fanatic or whatever. We've got another priest model here that's probably much better for an actual Sigmarite warrior priest. I would probably use the first model for flagellants. We've got a human with gun here, which could obviously be your handgunners. Human with gun on a horse, that could be your pistoliers, or it could also function as your outriders. A knight, pretty Bretonian looking. Another knight, pretty Bretonian looking. Archer, which the Empire and Bretonia have that. Catapult, which would obviously be used as a Bretonian trebuchet. Cannon for the Empire, and a steam tank. That pretty much does it for the human faction. You'll note a lot was missing. Obviously, they didn't have things like the Demigryph Knights. There was a lot of War Machine options missing, but that's why these armies are just basic. You're going to have to do quite a bit of substituting. If we go to Elves, which this is just all Elves, there is no different Elven category. So you've just got a Elf, which that would obviously be your Lord. Elf Wizard to cover for all three armies. Elf on Deer, which this is mainly for the Wood Elves. Sisters of the Thorn, Glade Riders, so you could use it for any army. Another elf. This is supposed to be a Cold One rider, Cold One Knight, but obviously it could be used for any heavy cav. Elf Wizard on horse, pretty straightforward, even though it's on a unicorn. Though oddly enough, if that were actually a tabletop unicorn, that's the wrong base size. A elf with a halberd, so that could obviously be your Blackguard, White Lions, Phoenix Guard, Executioners, Wildwood Rangers, etc. Elves Cart, which is supposed to be a chariot. I'm not sure why they call them carts for the basic armies. That might have been like a translation error. This one's obviously a White Lion chariot, but it could be used as any of them. An Eagle, which could be used as a Great Eagle, or a Warhawk for the Wood Elves. This one says Elf Wizard, but it looks more like a Dark Elf Beastmaster, though I suppose if you were just looking for different models, you could use that. This is Elf Spearman model, which all three Elven armies have. This elf, that could be anything from Witch Elves to War Dancers, things along those lines. Your Tree Man, which you could also secondary function as a type of bunch of types of monsters. Elf with a bow, pretty generic. Ballista, so that could be used as the High Elf and Dark Elf bolt throwers. Assassin, which is always pretty straightforward. You could also use that as some of the Wood Elf hero models, like the Shadow Dancer. Dryad with that awful purple base, which could be used pretty much only as Dryads, because I don't think the Elves have any other 25mm base units. And then a Manicore, which can be used to, of course, represent your Lord Riding One or things of that nature. Next, we have the Lizardmen. They're pretty straightforward. And this army is not super exciting, though it does have the basic essentials, I guess. Here's your basic lizard man. This one is the size of a Saurus, so this is your 25mm base. So you could use this for like a Warrior of Chaos or a Saurus or any of those guys. Big lizard man. This one is supposed to be a Croxagore. It could also function for other armies. Something like you could use it for an Ushabti or Ushabti if you're playing Tomb Kings and things of that nature. You could use it as like a Crypt Horror if you're playing Vampire Counts. This one is a very terribly designed skink model, which could be used for anything 20 mil. So that's elves, humans, dwarves. But that's your skink. This is the chameleon skink model. Then we've got our Cold One Rider, which that one's actually not too terrible. This one is named Pterodactyl, despite the fact that it's supposed to represent the Pterodon from the Lizardman list. That you could also use it as Ripperdactyl or other flying cavalry. Triceratops, which is obviously the Stegodon, though it could be used to just function as any monster that's on a cavalry or a chariot-sized base, such as most dragons, hydras, things of that nature. Lizardman on T-Rex, that's your Carnosaur Lord, though it could be really nicely used to function as any monstrous rider, just because most of the armies, even if they do have a monster, don't have a rider on the top, so you could use this to be your Orc War Boss on a Wyvern, whatever you want to call it, or a Elf on a Manicore, things of that nature. And then Lizards, which this is obviously a Jungle Swarm, which could be used for any of the swarm models that your army may have. Dwarves. This one's also pretty straightforward. We got a dwarf here, which is obviously supposed to be our Dwarf Lord. This one just looks like a really generic warrior. There's nothing else really to add to that. We got a crossbowman here. This one is the only, I believe, dwarf with a shield, so this one would have to be like your Iron Breakers. This would have to be your hammers and everything else. This would have to be everything from your Thunderers to your Cross Quarrelers to all that stuff. We've got a okay Slayer model here, definitely not the best by any means. Gyrocopter, which could function as, of course, as your Gyrocopter and your Gyro Bombers. And then a cannon and a catapult, which should be called a Grudge Thrower. Obviously, you would have to use these war machines to sub in for a lot, so this one would probably have to function as a flame cannon and an organ gun and all that stuff. And obviously, this army has a really small selection of dwarves, and there's not really a great Rune Lord model or any of that stuff. And you'll notice none of these armies have banner carriers as well, so if you have a battle standard bearer for your army, it's not great. Mutant Rats, aka Skaven. We've got a Wizard Rat, which is supposed to look like a Greyseer. Once again, most of these basic armies are really terribly designed models that didn't have a lot of effort put into them. But this is your Wizard Rat. So Greyseer, Plague Priest, Warlock Engineer, whatever. Mutant Rat, this is just your generic guy who could be a Skaven Slave or a Clan Rat, whatever. Mutant Rat, this one's obviously supposed to be your Storm Vermin, though I suspect that one actually may have the incorrect base size. Rat, this one's your Giant Rat model, which can be used for your Giant Rat packs, things of that nature. Big Mutant Rat, this is obviously your Rat Ogre. And then your cannon, which is supposed to be a Warp Lightning cannon. You'll notice there's nothing for Hell Pit Abominations or Doom Wheels or any of the accessory models that join up with units, weapon teams, such as Rattling Guns or Warp Fire Throwers or any of that. Next, we have the Undeads. You've got your Skeletal Rider, which I believe is the only cavalry model. Yep, so that would have to function as everything from your Blood Knights, unless you decided to mix and match your armies, which I normally suggest. But this could be your Black Knights or your Tomb King Skeletal Horsemen or anything of that nature. You got your basic skeleton here. Nothing exciting about him. And then you have this undead model, who I guess is supposed to be some kind of graveguard, despite the fact that he has flesh, so I'm not sure what that's about. Zombie, pretty straightforward. A cart, which should be called a chariot. Pretty okay model for the Tomb Kings, though it could use a lot of more flourish. Scorpion, obviously for the Tomb Kings, but this is a good 50 mil base for if you want to use it for any armies monsters. Vulture, clearly the carrion from the Tomb King list, though you could also use it for Vargulfs, or Varguides, excuse me. And then a Screaming Skull Catapult. So this one was obviously designed with a Tomb King aesthetic in mind, so it's not great for vampire counts, but at the end of the day, it gets the job done. Next is the Orcs and Goblins, which we've got a Goblin Cart, or a Chariot as it should be called, which will have to function as all of your chariots. A Goblin on Wolf, which you could also use to substitute as any kind of cavalry, including Spider Riders. Just a generic Orc. This guy represents all your orcs, despite the fact he's supposed to look more like a savage orc. So this is your black orc, and your savage orcs. Super exciting, I know. Then we've got basic goblins, night goblins with just a shank or a dagger, ballistas, and catapults, which would have to function as both your catapults and your doom divers. Obviously, there is a absolute metric ton missing from this list. No monsters, no Arachnarok spiders, none of that. Next and last is the ogres, which we've got our basic ogre, and then you've got another basic ogre, which can function a little better as a man-eater or a iron gut. Then we've got our yetis, who could also function as gorgers. Frights, which I'm not sure how they got the name Fright, but these are your Novelars. Sabertooth, which is of course the saber tusk that the ogres have, and then the ogre on Rhino, which seems to have been based off the old Rhinox model, since they called it a Rhino, but it would function now as your Mournfang cavalry. Now, and that's pretty much all of them, but just going through them, every single base size is available except for one, and that is the base size they introduced in 8th edition for giant monsters, which I will go ahead and show. Let me pull up an army that actually has one of those. Let's do ogres. Nope, one of these does. But so beyond that, there's most of the armies are pretty. They'll get the job done. They're nothing special. They're not gonna be super wow or anything, but they'll allow you to play. Which at the end of the day, that's what matters. Okay, I think this one has a properly sized Arachnarok. This is not an army I made. This is an army I downloaded from someone else, which I will show probably in the next video. Yeah, so that is the actual base size for the Arachnarok, which, to give you perspective, that's a Werven on a chariot base. So this base size is gigantic, and none of the basic armies have that available. Every other base size is there, including Monstrous Cavalry, being you would have to use the Ogre on Rhino model. But that pretty much does it for the basic armies, which might give you some insight about if this website is something you want to try. So now, let's talk about terrain. Alright, excuse me. There are 6 main armies, or not armies, maps. So you've got grass, background, urban, which is, concrete, very popular for 40k maps or cities. Desert, snow, soil, which is kind of ruined stuff that you'd expect to see like in the Badlands, and then water for ship battles or Dreadfleet, which is pretty rare on here. Then within each category, you've got all the appropriate things to represent various walls. In the wall section, you'll also find the giant template, which for those of you who do not play tabletop, this template is used because when giants die in tabletop, they fall over. So you would actually put this on the edge of the giant's base in which direction he fell over, and anyone underneath that takes a crud ton of damage. It's very not fun to have a giant fall on you. You'll notice some of these terrain features are more themed for 40k, such as these 2 trench options, but the rest are pretty good for fantasy. I mean, we've even got the blazing barricade option when you're randomizing terrain. Hills, pretty straightforward. They're pretty good sized, have multi-tiers, or some of them can have these more gravelly slopes if you want to represent dangerous terrain. And then there's just a desert hill and a snowy hill. Next, we have our plants, which are used typically to make forests. which there are different variants so that you're able to sort of mix and match them so you can make larger woods. This is the one I tend to use more for tabletop when I'm playing games or teaching lessons, but sometimes I'll combine a few of them like that to make it into a larger forest, which is fine. There's even a jungle themed, or that could be desert themed, I suppose. And then there's individual tree types, which there's a bunch of them. So you can use these to make whatever kind of forest you want. It just kind of takes time on that. But sometimes, like me, you might be like me, that I'm dedicated to making a certain themed map, and so that's important to me. Next is the ruin. Most of this can be used just to represent impassable or dangerous terrain. And these are just basically fallen sections of buildings. I use them most often for dangerous terrain, though sometimes I'll use them to accent. And this I actually use as a hill sometimes. I use it as the temple of the gods from the random terrain chart, which functions as a hill. So I'll use that, or you can use it as a really big building if you want to do that as well. Next are our water features. We have different kinds of lakes, including a ice lake if you want to have water features but don't want them like hurting your actual deployment movement. Then there are various kinds of rivers. So obviously to make a functioning river that goes into a lake, you kind of have to link them together and do all that kind of shenanigans. But it works pretty well. So those are all the various river and lake types. This is also the section where you'll find your marshes. So there's only 2 of them. They're just basically 2 different sizes, but they get the job done just because randomizing a marsh is pretty rare. Next are our rocks, which are pretty straightforward. It's just 3 different size rocks that aren't that different in shape, and then this sort of semicircle thing. Not a lot of variants. I have used those to build a Battle for the Past scenario, which I will show one day probably when I'm recording one of my lessons, where literally these entire sections of the map are just filled in with rocks, and then as the scenario suggests, you just have a fight to the death in the center. It's actually quite a bit of fun. Then we've got the various section, which has different kinds of graves to allow you to make your terrain a lot more thematic or exciting. There's also a full-size graveyard, so you don't have to build the entire thing yourself. There's different skeleton models, though they're really small. This is also where you'll find the basic Sphinx, and then the statue, which can also just function in like an imperial city or as just a smaller Sphinx. And there's also these squares. I don't use these terribly often. Some people do, some people don't, just depending on their preference, but they can be used to represent like a hole in the ground or something along those lines. Then we have our patches, which these are literally just these tiles here, but just a patch of them, so that you're able to create things like if this was a grass map, you could use this to represent a small lake that has a really deep puddle in the center that could be treated as dangerous terrain, or you could use this patch of snow to represent some kind of objective. And there's also this road, which is really useful when making maps of cities. Finally are the buildings. We have the bridge types. I will probably never recommend using this bridge here on the right because it's so horrendously tiny. It's just not useful for tabletop in the slightest, other than just for some thematic stuff. This one works pretty well, but normally when I deploy it across rivers, I deploy it sideways and just pretend that the barriers on the side aren't there so that units can actually fit across, because otherwise you have to deploy like just a bunch of these to make a reasonable river crossing. Then this is the castle, which is just the opening, which gives you a good setup and saves a little time for if you want to build like an off-the-map castle, or if you want to make an entire map into a castle, this is a good place to start. Then there are different kinds of houses, including these really weird circular ones, which I tend to use as sorcerer's portals. But these obviously can function as just your run-of-the-mill buildings, or grail chapels, or samurai temples, or whatever terrain you may need. And there's a pretty good variance of them. watchtowers, circular buildings. This one's kind of weird just because it's black and white. I use that as a haunted mansion. Another small circular building. And then there are 2 pyramid types, one large, one small. And then the turret, which I sometimes use as a watchtower, though my preferred tower is this one. And that pretty much does it for all of the terrain options. As you can see, there's quite a bit of variance. There's also this random position button, which I never recommend using because although it seems like it would work, what you'll notice as I continue doing this is that it'll start to put the terrain in weirder and weirder places, like not on the map at all, which isn't necessarily super fun. This time it's actually behaving pretty well. Normally it has a bad habit of shoving all the terrain on top of each other, or just vaguely on the map. So you can use it if you just want to be super lazy and get it over with. I'm personally not recommending of it. And obviously this allows for once you finish a map, you can load a map really, really quick. So I'll just go into here and let's open up my practice folder. And I mean, I just have a bunch of maps here, and I can just click one kind of randomly, and boom, there's my map. And you can see that this actually took quite a bit of work to make, just because there are roads. These are individual trees. This is a patch. These are all individual patches that were positioned over this hill to make it look like a shore. These are a bunch of rocks thrown together. These are multiple forests combined. These are all individual skeletons, the giant model, and then this is a mess. This is patches combined with ruins, combined with rocks, combined with bodies. So there is a ton of variance. And this is even multiple hills put together. So you'll find that you can really do anything that you can really imagine with the terrain. Obviously without going too far, so you can't make like a lava themed map, much to my sadness. But you can do anything that you need to play pretty much any game of Warhammer imaginable. I really, once again, recommend this program. It's really solid. I use this to teach lessons, and I use this to play Warhammer on my personal time. I hope you enjoyed this second tutorial video on Universal Battle. Next time, we will be going over how to create your own models and how to download other people's armies and maps. So we'll work on that next time, but for now, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day. Have a good night.